October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday. At 9:30 in the morning, the New York Stock Exchange opened to chaos. Within 6 hours, Americans had lost $14 billion, more than the entire Canadian economy was worth at the time. 13 million shares were sold in blind panic. Phone lines jammed, brokers screamed into dead receivers, and communication with the trading floor broke down completely. No one could stop the fall. But few people realized that this disaster, the one that would trigger 10 years of economic agony and change the lives of an entire generation, began not with a war or a political coup, but with the decision of one man. A man the newspapers had called Sunshine Charlie. His real name was Charles Edwin Mitchell, and once upon a time, he was America's most admired banker. Mitchell was born in 1877 to a humble farming family in Massachusetts. He had no pedigree, no wealth, no connection to Wall Street, but he had charisma, an unshakable confidence, and a talent for convincing people to believe in him. At the age of 42, he had risen to the top of the financial world, becoming president of National City Bank, the largest bank in the United States. It was a giant, holding more assets than most countries' budgets. Yet Mitchell wanted more than control over money. He wanted to change how Americans thought about money. At the time, the stock market was an exclusive playground. Barely 500,000 Americans owned any shares at all, less than 1% of the population. The rest kept their savings in banks or bought government bonds. To most people, Wall Street was a distant world of top hats, marble columns, and privilege. Mitchell wanted to break that barrier. He declared, every American should be a capitalist. And with that idea, he decided to democratize Wall Street. In 1920, he created a subsidiary called the National City Company, designed to sell stocks directly to ordinary people through local bank branches. Now, when someone came to deposit a paycheck or open a savings account, they would be offered something new, a piece of the American dream. Mitchell's campaign was revolutionary. He filled newspapers with glowing advertisements. Invest just $15 a month. Become a partner in America's future. Posters showed smiling families in front of big houses and shiny cars, with slogans like, thanks to our stocks, we bought our dream home. Magazines told stories of secretaries who became rich and streetcar drivers who bought houses with their dividends. Mitchell's salesmen were trained not as bankers, but as storytellers. They knew how to appeal to emotion, to pride, to hope, to greed. They made people believe that buying a share wasn't speculation, it was patriotism. That every ordinary worker could now own a piece of Ford, General Electric, or AT&T. But the true genius, and the true danger, of Mitchell's plan was how he made it affordable. He popularized a method called buying on margin. You didn't need the full price of a stock. You could put down just 10% of your own money and borrow the rest from the bank. It felt like magic. Invest $100, buy $1,000 in stock. If the price rose by 20%, you doubled your money. Mitchell's clerks demonstrated this on paper, showing simple examples that made everyone feel like a financial genius. In a world where factory jobs paid $20 a week, the promise of easy wealth was irresistible. From 1925 to 1929, the volume of loans for stock purchases exploded from $2 billion to $8.5 billion, a 425% increase in just 4 years. The number of Americans who owned stocks grew from 500,000 to over 10 million. A teacher in Ohio mortgaged her home to buy shares of Radio Corporation. A Kansas farmer sold his cattle to invest in General Motors. A Detroit mechanic put half a year's wages into Ford stock. America was falling in love with speculation. And at the center of it all stood Charles Mitchell, hailed as a visionary, the man who made every American a potential millionaire. By 1928, he was earning the modern equivalent of $20 million a year. He was everywhere, in magazines, on the radio, the smiling face of prosperity. But even as he enjoyed his fame, the numbers began to turn against him. By early 1929, stocks were rising far faster than the economy itself. Some companies were trading at 15 times their annual profits, levels that even today would scream bubble. The Federal Reserve began to worry. On February 6, 1929, it sent out a warning to all banks. Stop lending money for speculation. The market, it said, was overheating. For a moment, it seemed that the fever might finally break. In March, prices started to fall. Billions were lost in days. Panic began to spread. And then Charles Mitchell made the decision that would define his legacy. On March 12th, he called a press conference and declared, National City Bank will provide the market with all the liquidity it needs. We will not allow an unnecessary crisis. The effect was immediate. Headlines proclaimed, Sunshine Charlie saves the market. Stocks bounced back. Within a week, all losses were erased. Confidence returned, and so did the madness. Through the summer of 1929, share prices reached historic highs. The Dow Jones climbed to 381 points, a record that would not be surpassed for another quarter of a century. 3 million new investors joined the market in the final months before the crash. Wives pawned their jewelry to buy stocks. Shoe shiners gave investment tips to businessmen. Even children used pocket money to speculate. The entire country was drunk on the illusion of endless prosperity. But beneath the glitter, the mathematics of catastrophe was already in motion. Every dollar invested was backed by only 10 cents of real money. A 10% drop in prices would wipe out an investor completely. A 50% drop would leave them in debt for years. And those drops were coming. By the fall, the so-called smart money, pension funds, insurance companies, and old Wall Street families began quietly selling. They saw what others ignored: declining industrial production, falling car sales, a slowdown in construction. The economy was cracking even as stock prices soared. They also knew the Federal Reserve was preparing to raise interest rates, which would make margin loans more expensive and trigger a cascade of forced selling. Still, the public kept buying. And then came Thursday, October 24th, 1929. At the opening bell, major investment funds began dumping stocks in huge blocks. Prices dipped, then plunged. By noon, brokers couldn't keep up with the orders. Margin calls poured in. Investors couldn't pay. Banks began selling their collateral, which only made prices fall further. A chain reaction of destruction was unleashed. The dominoes fell one after another. Falling prices triggered margin calls. Margin calls triggered forced sales. Forced sales triggered more declines. And when the collateral became worthless, the banks themselves began to fail. 5 days later, on October 29th, Black Tuesday, the market collapsed completely. In a single day, $14 billion disappeared, more than the United States had spent on World War I. The richest nation on earth was brought to its knees. But behind the numbers were people, teachers, farmers, clerks, mechanics, whose dreams evaporated overnight. Edward Hopkins, a Detroit mechanic, had put his life savings, $5,000, count 'em, into Ford stock. By November, it was worth $200. When the bank demanded more collateral, he hanged himself in his garage. A teacher in Ohio lost her family's home to repossession. In New York, the Brooklyn Bridge became a grim symbol of despair. As the Depression deepened, anger turned toward the man who had promised them all prosperity. Charles Mitchell was called to testify before Congress in 1933. Senator Carter Glass asked him directly, "Do you consider yourself responsible for the ruin of millions of American families?" Mitchell's reply was cold. "I wanted to give people the opportunity to get rich. No one forced them to buy." To the public, it sounded like arrogance, a final insult from the man who had sold them the dream. He was later charged with tax evasion and forced to resign. The once celebrated Sunshine Charlie became a symbol of greed and hubris. People spat at him on the street. The New York Times called him the architect of financial catastrophe. A Detroit paper wrote, "A robber takes a bag of money, but Mitchell took the future from an entire generation." And yet, paradoxically, his bank survived. After Mitchell's fall, National City Bank received government support. It absorbed failed competitors and emerged even stronger. Mitchell, meanwhile, vanished into obscurity. He spent years in Europe as a consultant for small banks, then returned to the U.S. to open a modest investment firm. He died in 1955, still denying any guilt, but his actions had already rewritten the American financial system. In 1933, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act, separating commercial and investment banking forever. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to police the markets. Deposit insurance was introduced to protect savings. And strict rules on margin lending were enforced, all designed to ensure that such a collapse could never happen again. Yet history, as it always does, found a way to rhyme. Nearly a century later, the same promises echo once more. 50 million Americans now trade stocks on their smartphones. Apps like Robinhood offer zero commissions and slogans like "everyone an investor." Margin debt has reached $900 billion. The same leverage, adjusted for time, that fueled the 1929 collapse. People borrow money to buy crypto, meme stocks, digital dreams. And again, they believe that this time it's different. Charles Mitchell's ghost lingers in every glowing screen. His vision of a nation of investors has come true, and with it, the same dangerous faith in easy wealth. He wanted to give people a chance to rise. Instead, he taught the world how quickly dreams can destroy themselves. So the next time you hear the words democratized finance, remember Sunshine Charlie, the man who wanted to make everyone rich and instead plunged a nation into ruin. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the melody is always the same, the music of easy money and the silence that follows.